Welcome to the Ice Age Ponds project's first training course of the season. For those of you that haven't had any training before, that weren't involved in last year's project, a very brief introduction for you. This project is funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund, and we are very grateful for all those folk that buy lottery tickets, without which we wouldn't be able to do this work. It's a joint partnership project headed by Herefordshire Wildlife Trust with the Hereford Amphibian and Reptile team, who for a few decades now, or a decade at least now, have been championing the cause of Ice Age ponds and wanting to raise the profile and interest about Ice Age ponds in Herefordshire. We're also joined by the Herefordshire and Worcestershire Earth Heritage Trust, who provide the geological expertise for the project. This morning we're going to be doing an introduction to the survey of ponds, which will go towards our database on building information about Ice Age ponds in the county. Firstly, we're going to have an introduction to Ice Age ponds and their ecology by project ecologist Will Watson. This will be followed by a short safety talk, because we want you to be safe when you're out there monitoring these ponds. And we'll have a short comfort break, and then we'll have a talk by project ecologist Giles King Salter and project geologist Beth Andrews, who will be going through how to record the ponds on the recording sheet. Okay, well, without further ado, I will hand you over to Will Watson.
Okay, thank you, David. What did the Herefordshire landscape look like 14,000 years ago? Well, it was a very bare, sort of Arctic type landscape. And what you've got to imagine is that some of these areas were scraped clear by the glaciers, and other sites were perhaps they had remnants of soil. Now the slide on the photograph on the right has actually got a heather community developing around there, and that would have been a site where there's very little soil, and you could imagine this site on the other side as having sort of remnants of soil, and you get a different plant community establishing. This is the sort of more acid type habitat environment. It's this is a picture of a modern day blanket bog, actually in Staffordshire, and we have within the picture there's cotton grass, sphagnum, bulbous rush, and other plants associated with those type of acid conditions, and these kind of develop in a slightly different way. Over time they change. We know they change because we've got evidence of sphagnum in our ponds. We found evidence, I'll come on to that later, but the water chemistry has obviously since changed, which is quite an interesting process and quite an interesting thought. This just sort of perhaps shows it's a shot. It's not the same pond, but it's taken the sort of same angle, and it shows a mesotrophic, that's middle range water pond with less vegetation because of the nutrients, the lack of nutrients. You tend to get less bulky plants developing. The sort of eutrophic pond on the right has got all the different zones of vegetation that we'd expect within a typical pond. Floating vegetation, submerged and emergent vegetation, was this one slightly poorer. So you can sort of see that one of these type of sites that the water they gradually changed over time, I guess as a result of soils developing and nutrients getting transported into the ponds over time. Now quite a lot of our ponds, we found peat beneath when we've taken cores. And this is really interesting because peat takes a long time to form. They reckon it takes, for 1 meter depth of peat takes 1,000 years to form. And they also, they're time capsules, so they're preserving really important things like pollen. And in the right hand side you can see twigs here. Well, these are, you might, you know, these are type of macrofossils really. And if you look at them carefully, you'll be able to tell what species of tree was present as we sort of enter the Holocene period. That's the period where things all start to warm up again. And actually this site was in the Brecon Beacons, and there were tree stumps, and those tree stumps, you could even tell what type of trees they were. There were oak, I think there was hazel, rowan, and even pine. And then I asked people how old they were, and they said, oh, they're about, they weren't as old as I thought, but you know, they were about 1,000 years old, they reckon. So if we look at one of the things that we've been doing, we did this at, we've done this at several sites last year because we had Birmingham University Geography Department came out with us, and we took cores. And this is one of the cores that we took, and you can see all the different layers there. I suspect this sort of brownie layer might represent the sphagnum. It's very typical of the type of cores that, you know, you get when you, or even when you pull up sort of the rotting material from the base of a sphagnum bog. Indeed, the graduate who looked at this did find sphagnum. So this is another core that was taken from Kenchester. And again, we found peat there. You've got to imagine that, well, you've got to understand that, you know, the evidence of peat is very important in this day and age now, because we're looking at the ability of ponds to capture carbon and things. And there was a statistic that's being spread about, I suppose now, that some ponds, well, blanket bogs, all the blanket bogs on Earth contain 4 times more carbon than all the trees on Earth. Now, we're still looking into how valuable ponds are, but certainly ponds that are already capturing carbon are extremely valuable in that process. So that's an ongoing study, if you like. We're looking into this now. So what were the plant communities? You know, we've looked at the pollen. So what sort of plant communities were there? We've got, you can see the typha there, and the other plant on the right is bog bean. Now we know from pollen, we actually got, you know, confirmed evidence of cinquefoil, which I suspect would have been marsh cinquefoil, sedges, sphagnum, as I've already mentioned, yellow water lily, meadowsweet, milfoil, floating pondweeds, grey, possibly goat willow. So that's, you know, that's a reasonable range. There are others as well, but perhaps not quite as aquatic. So we found evidence, of course, we also get evidence of all the trees round about, because the tree pollen then enters the pond and gets stored, you know, within the peat, within those sediments. So as you can see, if you know your botany, you'll know that that's a very broad range in terms of the water quality of those ponds. The other thing that we'd like to find, obviously, are mammoth. We'd love to find mammoth bones, but we're more likely to find things like this, which are macrofossils. And these have been found in other sites, but the water chemistry has got to be right. If it's too acid, they'll just dissolve and you won't get them. So far, we haven't really looked in any great detail. I have looked in some of the cores and I found plant material, and I've even been able to identify some of the plants, things like threadleaf pondweeds I found from Medlands Pond in Staunton on Arrow. But yeah, we'd love to find these. Just moving on from the sort of more historic side of things, in terms of how these ponds, the Ice Age ponds and Kettlehole ponds, which are part of the Ice Age complex, how they evolve, they're all subject to the process of succession. So they start off, as I showed in the very first slide, as open habitat, and then as time goes by, plants get established, and also sediment gets transported into the ponds from the surrounding catchment, and so you're getting transported sediment, and then as the plants grow and die, you get organic sediment building up. I think in this, the first, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the second one down shows submerged plants, and then there's floating plants, and then the second from the bottom shows emergent plants, and then finally trees and shrubs develop. And of course, if you take that a stage further, then you get the site drying out and woodland colonizing it, and that unfortunately is the fate of all ponds. So it's rather interesting, you know, well, how do these ponds survive for like 10,000 years? Well, I've got a few examples, and it's still something we're learning about these processes of how they survive. So let's just look at Ice Age ponds today. I haven't got a shot, unfortunately, from Britain, an aerial shot yet. That's something we need to perhaps work on, but this is from Germany, and it does illustrate that this these landforms, of course, are found right the way across Europe and indeed North America as well, because they obviously represent the coverage of ice from and the retreat from the Devengian glaciation. Unfortunately, typical with so many areas, you know, globally, obviously that the soil in a lot of positions is quite rich, and the farming has sort of eaten away at the edges of these sites. This field here, the one on the left, is there because you know, it's got so many ponds there that it wasn't worth plowing, you know, it wouldn't have been worth, and perhaps they couldn't even drain it because of that. So all the drains probably end up in there. You'll notice that there's some round ponds, typical of rounded blocks of ice, but also ponds in close proximity, and that's important for aquatic invertebrates because they can move between the different ponds. So that's typical of Kettlehole ponds, that they're often found in close proximity. Now we're just going to look at some of the sites I'll mention the rest of the talk. This shows the glacial hummocky moraine here in northwest Herefordshire. I don't know if you can make out these places, but there's Prestine at the top, there's Hereford at the bottom, there's Leominster in the east, and then these particular sites are the Sturts, Lower House Orchard, Moccas, Blakemere, Kenchester, and then Stockley Farm in Staunton-on-Arrow in the north. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of where we're talking about. Now we talk about Kenchester because it's at the end of the, it's really quite far east in terms of our distribution. It's at the end of the glacial moraine, and there are 16 ponds within 1.5 square kilometres in Kenchester, so it makes it very important for the ecology and also from a geological perspective as well. And it's and luckily we've got sympathetic landowners that allow us to visit and survey. This is the Withy Pool, and you'll notice here you've got a pretty natural type of fringe of aquatic vegetation. We're looking at the emergent vegetation around the edge. If you know other ponds, they don't always look this good, but this one looks really good, and indeed it is biologically good. The only thing that is slightly against it from a sort of anthropogenic point of view, people doing things to it, is you've got the introduction of crack willow trees that were planted around the edge. This is one of the specialities. It's tufted sedge. It's the only site well, sorry, it's they're only found in Kettlehole ponds within Herefordshire. And you can see it's quite a characteristic sedge. It's very large. You can see it's almost as the height of some of those crack willow trees. We've also got slender tufted sedge, the Withypool, and indeed the hybrid. The hybrid is has only been known from 3 sites within the United Kingdom up until now. So this is the 4th site for the hybrid. We've also found quite rare water beetles. This is Agabus euglenosus, recorded in 79 hectares out of 2,000 odd since the year 2000. Again, confined to Kettlehole ponds. This is another of the Kenchester ponds. This is the largest one. It's swells up to over 1 hectare in size. It's a special pond because it's sat above the Yazebrook aquifer and it fluctuates naturally, which is, you know, it's just fortuitous that it's there, and it makes for a very special pond. And as it draws down, the waters get concentrated, and sometimes you get a flush of ostracods. These are clamshells, and they're only about 2 millimeters. These are, although they're clamshells, these are actually large clamshells. And this is a photo taken by a friend of mine who's a specialist in macrophotography. They're really good food source for waterfowl. So you get ducks, like tufted ducks, and also shoveler has been recorded here, and they're coming in specially to feed on the ostracods. Another pond that is also in the Kenchester group is this one by the road, and I think it was either 2017 or 18. We actually did our first amphibian torching survey, and we were amazed to find over 200 great crested newts around this pond. And then on another, the largest pond, we also found 100, and then in total we found 400 on the one night, and that makes it the best recorded site within Herefordshire for great crested newts. And obviously that's you know, this is a Kettlehole site. We haven't even looked at the rest of the ponds, so we haven't done a full total count of all 16 ponds. It'd be great, you know, someday we'll do it all on one evening and get, you know, and get a really good count. Yeah, this of course is a great crested newt. Some of you will be familiar with this, but this is the male, and it's showing the breeding crest. It's showing the underbelly. It's obviously taken in an aquarium setup, but you've got the hornwort there that we so often find as an aquatic plant in ponds. Other creatures that we find, the water stick insect, generally found in quite nice ponds that are ecologically good. We found it at the pond by the road with all the great crested newts. In one of the other ponds I haven't even shown, I found this small red-haired damselfly. I think it was something like 2016. It's moved from the east, from Essex. It's a new colonizer. It came into the country in 2000, and then it made its way over, and at that point it was about the most westerly distribution. That's the black-tailed skimmer. Black-tailed skimmers like large ponds. They're always good to find. They're not found everywhere. Again, another of the Kenchester ponds, and this particular one, it's got its own little ecological niche, and it somehow it supports a really good toad population. I think it's the only one we found breeding toads only in this pond. But when we find them, we find swarms of them going around the edge. We still haven't done a toad count on this pond yet, but we also did a fish survey, and we plan to do more studies of the fish, and possibly if they've been introduced, we may do some management of those sites within the project. Well, we have found carp in there, and they've been introduced into the pond sadly and had a big impact. Just as you all know what toads look like. Just keep an eye on the time, so move on to the plants. We've got Golden Dock, and Peter Garner also found Marsh Dock, and he was pretty sure at the time it was the most westerly site within the United Kingdom for Marsh Dock. Only found a few ponds. We found plants. We found them in the particular toad pond just round the edge, and also we found 2 rare spike rushes actually, and one of them I think is the only site within Herefordshire. So again, so the Kenchester pools have proved really, really valuable, and again, you know, they're all ice age. They're all, you know, relate back 10,000 years. So how valuable is that? Okay, moving on. We'll move to the Sterts. Yeah, we're lucky to have a site that's got lots of kettlehole ponds that's being managed, you know, by the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, so that, you know, we have real opportunities to enhance these sites, you know, in the best we can, so that they're in good custodianship. What this slide shows is, ignore this pond here, clearly with an island and muddy due to carp, is a man-made pond, but these are not. These are the special type of kettlehole pond, really. We now know this to have been a lake bed, and then blocks of ice got grounded and then they melted, and you get very high concentrations of kettlehole ponds in these sites. You can just see that there's actually 2 in that field, I think, and yeah, so let's look at some of them. What we tend to get is a lot of, you know, emergent vegetation, you know, a good zone of vegetation around the pond. So you've got emergent, floating and submerged. The pond on the right, you'll see the feathery plant. If you can't see I think you can see my pointer now, but this is tubular water dropwort, which is a rare plant. I've got a slide of it now. Quite attractive. It's obviously an umbellifer, and it's a UK BAP species, and you know, scarce plant. And in Herefordshire, it's only confined to kettlehole sites. And again, with the beetles, we've got quite a, you know, good selection of water beetles, and we've got beetles that are nationally restricted, like Innocuous nigritis. IUCN vulnerable, that's International Union of Conservation of Nature. Certainly it was only recorded in 38 hectares. And you can see from this map that there's an isolated population representing the Herefordshire kettlehole ponds, whereas this population over here in East Anglia is representative of the pingos in the Brecklands and the East Anglian Fens. It has actually, of course, spread in. Well, it probably was always in the East Anglian Fens, but the fens have changed, so they're no longer natural, but it's persisted. But in Herefordshire, it seems to be confined to Ice Age ponds. Just looking at some of the other ponds on the Sterts, the photo on the right shows the very nice pond in the Sterts south. I sort of know this one to be really good for snipe, and I've seen curlew here in the past. I don't think recently though. And this is a photo of slender tufted sedge, which again is confined to Ice Age ponds in Herefordshire. And I mentioned about how ponds persist. Here we've got oxidization occurring in summer, and the organic matter is breaking down and it's releasing oxygen. So the sort of top layer of that pond is kind of breaking down, and that process is probably occurring every year. So the ponds can be incredibly, well, very shallow relative. I mean, they would have started off deep, but then they reach an equilibrium, and you get oxidization in summer. So they always retain that certain depth, and they've been persistent like this for 10,000 years. And we know that because we've taken cores, and we know that they are ancient Ice Age ponds. This is another slide of the oxygen bubbles. How are we doing for time? Is it all right? Don't worry. I'll carry on. Yeah, not to, I'll speed up a little bit if I can. Letton Lakes. This is the other side. And I just wanted to, I don't know if you can see this here. This is Lower House Orchard. This is one of the other sites that we're interested in, and it's on the eastern edge of the site of the Letton Lakes. But look at that field there. You've got about 20. I don't know. There's 15, I think, ponds you can see there. So it's got one of the highest densities of ponds, well, anywhere really, you know, anywhere in the country. And this is a Google Earth slide shot, and this is Lower House Orchard here. You can see it's been fenced off, and it's become quite well. They planted a lot of trees, to be fair, there, and that's our field there at a slightly different time of year. And then there's other wetlands there, so it's a really interesting area. Just moving on to Moccas. Moccas, you may know of this. This is the lawn pool at Moccas. You can see lawn pool here, and it's obviously, you know, one of our iconic sites. Really attractive Ice Age pond. I think some of you might be going there tomorrow or on Sunday. And it's known for bladderwort. It's the only site where bladderwort is found, certainly in a natural situation. It's Utricularia australis. There's several species, yeah, you can see that in the late summer. Obviously, it's these bladders trap water fleas, so that's so it's usually found in ponds that are sort of low in nutrients, so it's able to get extra nutrients that way. Some of you may know about the fact that we've got medicinal leech in Herefordshire. It was last seen in the lawn pool in Moccas in the year 2000. The last time I actually saw adult leeches was in 2005, but I have since found cocoons belonging to medicinal leech. We haven't actually found any during the time period of our project, which is a bit frustrating, but it's very hit and miss. But it's a very rare species, protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. That's the cocoon, where you can search for those in moorhens' nests. This is the rare beetle that's associated with Moccas Park, which was last found, well, it was found in 1973, and then I refound it in 2016 after a very long gap of 40 years. So there's some hope for us yet. And this is isolated from other sites, populations. You know, that all other populations are 100 kilometers away. Finally is Blakemere. I want to mention this site because we've been wanting to visit this site for a long time, due to its, you know, it's east of Moccas Park, and it's, you know, it looked quite, you know, roughly similar to the lawn pool in shape, and you know, it's in the sort of same area, so we were very hopeful about this pool, and we weren't disappointed. This is another slide of it, just showing the valuable emergent vegetation. I just wanted to briefly show the crack willow that's invading the open space, the open water. But yeah, we were rewarded by finding this rare water beetle. It's Agathis undulatus. It's called undulatus, by the way, because of this undulating band between the thorax and the wing cases here. Just to show you again the rarity of it, if you can see, this is where else. There's just two populations really in the United Kingdom up until then, associated with the Bretlands and the East Anglian fens, and then this is one of the mosses in in Yorkshire, and then we just found a new population. And according to the Balfour Brown Club, the Water Beetle Club, it's very rare to find a new species of, well, a new site for a rare water beetle. That's simply because there's a lot of people actually looking. So, so that's a real feather in our cap, really. The future is to manage these sites so that, you know, we remove some of the overhanging vegetation to open up the pond as it used to be, and allow the emergent vegetation to grow. And this is that's Blakemere. That's top Blakemere, bottom Kenchester. That's what we worked on, I think about 8 years ago, and we had a lot of aquatic vegetation. We had a 30% increase in species just from doing that. So, you know, it's really good dividend, you know, it results from that. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that because I might have overrun a little bit, and you can ask questions later. Okay, thanks.
Right. That's fine, Will. Thank you. Before you go into your pond safety theme, perhaps it might be an appropriate time for people to ask questions, if people have any, if they'd like to unmute and ask questions, either on verbally or on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're ready to go. Yeah. Well, you know, in health and safety, you've got to ask the question, haven't you? What's the worst that can happen? And I guess the worst that can happen usually, yeah, I mean, drowning is an issue, but usually it's getting wet. So, I think I did a search for this, and I came across this extraordinary slide just moments before she just plunges into this really leafy. I could imagine it being not the nicest of ponds with lots of soft leaves and things that accumulate, because as the leaves fall, they don't, you know, they accumulate, they don't break down. So I know what it's like within ponds, and you know, I'm very familiar with the characteristics you get in certain ponds and certain conditions. So you have to be, you know, careful. I just want to show you some other examples, you know, the worst examples. And I should really say right at the beginning, we're not going to take you to any of these type of ponds, but there are quite dangerous sites. This was a site I came across in Cheshire, and it's a brick pond. So they were quarrying clay for bricks, and they weren't thinking about safety, and they had a vertical edge. So, and then it filled with water. I don't know the depth of it, but it was only like a meter from the edge, and my pond net just totally disappeared. So we had to survey these ponds for great crested newts and put bottle traps out, and more than once I got, you know, quite wet. So yeah, but luckily didn't go you know, fall right in or anything. So yeah, we have to, you know, you have to prepare for these. So whoops, just yeah, here I'm doing two things. I'm finding out, checking out the pond really for other groups, finding out how deep it is, and you know, finding out the sediment. I've got chest waders on, but I'm used to wearing chest waders. We just want you to wear Wellington boots, unless of course you're you know, used to do it wearing waders. If you want to, you know, if you want to progress further over time, we you know, we'll take it stage by stage, but generally as volunteers, we're just expecting you to dip from the edge. So and we'll also take you to safe sites, and we'll do you know, health and safety risk assessments and things from each site. Yeah, water is it carries a lot of water, but there's a lot of waterborne pathogens, and we do have to be careful. You know, it's quite a serious issue, really. This is actually a slide showing bacteria. It's easier for bacteria and other pathogens and things to be transferred by water than it is via soil. This site, this particular site, just happens to show a mound of horse muck and everything else. That's actually not a pond, but it's a pool of water that's accumulated. But it shows the point. And if you do have a cut, please tell us. And probably won't want you to go dipping if you have a cut. In fact, we definitely won't. So yeah, if you do have an open wound, you know, on your hand, and you know, you'll get going in, that's how you get infections. And I have actually had E. coli on 2 separate occasions, blood poisoning from ponds. One because there was sewage entering the pond, and one was near a cemetery, so it's not nice. It was probably my own fault. I think at least on the one occasion I did actually have a very small graze, and that was enough to get infected. So yeah, we want to try and avoid that at all costs. The other thing we have to consider in this day and age, well, yeah, there's another from is biosecurity. There's several, well, there's a lot of species now that can be spread, but obviously the biggest impact are those species that are present in Herefordshire now, and they can be spread in various different ways, usually through the treads in our footwear. But you know, there are other ways. Dealing with the plant side first, you mentioned about invasives. This is a plant called New Zealand pygmyweed, also known as Crassula. That's the generic name, Crassula helmsii. This is actually a close-up. I'm not really intending to do a full talk on this, but we can include more information later, particularly if we're going to cover aquatic plants. I think it would be useful to cover this because New Zealand pygmyweed is present in a large range of ponds. We do know it from we know it from ponds in the Kettlehole Moraine. I'm not quite sure how many actual Kettlehole ponds have got it, but you know, I can think of, you know, I've come across at least 20 ponds in Herefordshire with it, and it's so easily spread because it's a succulent plant, and it has no insects that feed on it at the moment. So it has no sort of natural biological control within the United Kingdom. So it just spreads and spreads and spreads and smothers all the other plants out. And so we end up with a very boring monoculture of New Zealand pygmyweed. And the newts don't really like laying their eggs on it. So it kind of depletes the diversity as well. So it's a big problem for us. So what, yeah, okay, I'm just seeing my next slide. It's the other problem biosecurity wise is the this signal crayfish. The top one is the signal, which diagnostically you're probably wanting to know. The claws do have a bit of red on them. The difference between this, yeah, the carapace here on the white-clawed crayfish. This is the white-clawed. It's got a little point here that's. So you can see, I really need to do a separate talk on it to cover, you know, the identification. But basically, the point is that this signal crayfish was introduced from North America, and it carries a crayfish plague, which has affected the white-clawed crayfish, and they don't have any defense against it. And so just by walking in a stream, you know, from one stream that's got the signal into a stream that's got the white-clawed, you're very likely going to spread the plague, the crayfish plague, and then they, you know, very soon they disappear. So in fact, we've only got white claws. Generally, we got whiteclaws in upper catchments of small streams, with small streams in the county, and then they're devoid in the larger rivers, or largely devoid. There may be a slight comeback. I think I've read a few things where they've done eDNA, but it's still extremely vulnerable to the crayfish plague. So far, we haven't found many in ponds, but you know, that's not to say they're not there. That's either species, so it's possible that, you know, there are relic populations of white-clawed crayfish in ponds. But they would tend to be in ponds that don't have a lot of silt, because the white-clawed crayfish doesn't tolerate a lot of sediment. So we don't, so far, we don't think it's a particularly big issue, but we need to be aware of it, you know, but it's something that we'll, you know, we'll be looking at. Just to show you what you can do, and should do, you know, is check the soles of your wellies and things, because that's where the crassula accumulates. And then the other thing that it's wise to do is to sterilize your equipment at the end of each session. There are other sort of pond pathogens that could be passed over, you know, and we don't want to be really responsible for spreading things from pond to pond. It's Virkon, isn't it? I think there's little things that you can get. That we've got some of this, so yeah, we'll be using this at the end of the day, just to you know, to ensure that we're hopefully, you know, we won't spread anything from site to site. I'm just going to end up, because obviously with COVID, you all know about this 2 meter distance, but then I thought, well, there must be a better way of illustrating this. What is 2 meters? That is 2 meters. I think that sort of from a psychological point of view, we all have a picture in our heads what is 2 meters, and then we take it from each other what is 2 meters, but we never actually measure it. It's actually probably slightly further away than we're thinking. So this is obviously 2 people with a 2 meter tape between them, showing that it is, yeah, a little bit further maybe. So just something to bear in mind with COVID. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Will. That's great.
For the second half of this, myself, I'm the project officer and a geologist. This is really important for those who haven't met me before. Plants and animals, not my thing, unless it's a mammoth. So luckily, we have Giles, who will be joining for this, and in fact doing the vast majority of the talking, to help with the pond work. Now, we've got a 5-page pond survey form. If you were involved in the training now, frighteningly 2 years ago, you'll notice there's been a few tweaks and changes. It's not radically different, but we have changed the order slightly and added a few bits and taken a few bits away. This is because we asked our lovely volunteers who helped us in the development stage how they found the form, and they came back and made suggestions and bits they didn't like. So we've done our best to tweak it, as it were. So you might notice some differences. So this little bit, we're going to go through genuinely question by question what you're looking for. Hopefully this will make sense. The advantage of this is that over the next couple of days, for those who are able to join us over the weekend, you'll get a chance to actually practice filling them in. So it's not just us telling you, you'll actually be doing it. For those who aren't able to join us this weekend, there will be the opportunity to do more training. But it should make sense one at a time. And after this, you are welcome to ask us questions and we'll try and go back and fill any gaps in. So let me go on. So I'm Beth, because I think you only got a tiny headshot, and that's me with my hands covered in a very blue-green clay from Kenchester again. And the other photo is Giles, who will be talking very briefly. So page 1. This is a quick look of what it looks like. You'll notice it's mostly blank. That's for the picture. So questions. Surveyor name. This is your name, the person doing the form filling. This is just so that we can go back. If we go, wow, that pond sounds great, it allows us to go back. Or perhaps, because there does tend to be the occasional slip up with entering grid references, sometimes there's a bit where we have to go, is this where you were? So it just allows us to go back and check. The date you did a pond survey, really helpful. Ponds in early March don't look the same as ponds in mid-May or indeed late September. So it does help if we've got an inkling of what time of year it was when you visited the pond. And pond name. When we're going out, it's quite possible we will be asking you to visit ponds we've already got a name for, like Lawn Pool. It's a well-known used name. Sometimes they're ponds that have been surveyed or given to us and they say, oh, this is what the farmer calls it. Equally, if you just get told, here's a grid reference, visit this pond, and it doesn't have a name, please give it a name. However, please don't call it Pond 1 or Pond A. That's because currently on our database, we have somewhere in the order of 1,700 ponds. So numbers, not so helpful. Quite a lot of them have names like Pond 1 or Pond A. So something descriptive. So Northwood Farm Woodland Pond or Duck Pond, something like that. Just something to help us identify it. Crack Willow Pond, just something that you think might be at least unusual, ideally unique. And then grid reference. We do need a 10-figure grid reference for this. Anyone who's used to using maps might be used to 6-figure grid references, occasionally 8-figure, but for the purposes of our GIS, we really need 10-figure grid references. If you think back to some of those lovely aerial photos and maps that Will was showing, there are often times when there are several ponds within quite a small area. In those cases, the accuracy of the others might well be off. So feel free to use your own GPS devices. For keen cyclists and walkers, you might well have something. You can use an app for your phone or tablet if you have one. Quite a lot of all people's phones will have them. About half of people's tablets will have them. There are a couple of free ones I'm going to mention. If you don't have that technology, that's fine. Just let us know, because we have some tablets that we can lend you along with the rest of the pond survey kit, and they'll have the app included. So there are a couple of apps you might want to use. These are free to download. So there's one called GeoExplore by Brooks Designs that works on Apple and Android devices. So go to your shop of choice, download it. It's free. You will not be charged. If it says it's going to charge you, it's the wrong app. And you get it, you click on the app icon and this opens up. So you click on the button that says Tools. It's a purple button in the top. And when you click on that, this purple list comes up. And there's a big long list. And the important thing is right at the bottom, it has an SO thing. All the ponds we send you to are in Herefordshire and will be SO as the prefix. And then a nice 10-figure grid reference. It might be that you want to tell us how accurate the app thinks it is. This is not a reflection on you or indeed your phone. In which case, you click on the little plus button and it pulls up this extra bit of information. And it has a horizontal accuracy written in just above where it says SO. For anyone who's interested or whatever, this app is also a good one to have because it has built in the what 3 words information, which will locate you to within a 3 meter by 3 meter grid across the entire planet's surface using a 3-word approach. Where I was stood to take these screenshots was hindered approach defrost. All I can say is it's absolutely distracting, and for the purposes of ponds, not helpful for us, but really, really good in other concepts, mountain rescue being one. So the other app you might wish to use is called Grid Reference by Arthur Embleton. It's free to download, but unfortunately only available for Android devices. It is a little GR icon. You download it from your Play Store, click the GR icon, and this page comes up. It'll tell you a grid reference and tell you how accurate it is. With all of these, if you've been keeping your phone in your bag or your pocket, give your phone a minute or so to try and find the satellites flying overhead. Usually you'll see the accurate to come down. Don't worry about the fact one tends to say it's more accurate than the others. I did quite a lot of experimenting with this. They are much of a muchness because it's the same phone and the same satellites. If when you download this app the first time, it comes up with just a 6-figure grid reference, you can see in the top right-hand side, there's a button, a little bit that says figures. Click on that, and it gives you a choice of 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10. Select 10. This app does remember which one you opted for. So once you've selected it once, the next time you open the app, it will know that you asked for a 10-figure. So Pond Sketch, and I'm going to hand you over to Giles at this point.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Yeah, so I'll carry on with the rest of the form now. So the sketch map, we think it's quite helpful if you do this when you first arrive at the pond. So really just, it doesn't have to be as detailed as this sketch is here, but the main thing is to get an idea of the outline of the pond and also any key features around the pond, like for instance, trees, whether or not they're overhanging, and also features like fences or hedges or roads or paths, partly because they help you kind of orient yourself in respect to the pond. And then the two other things which are quite important is one, to indicate the direction of north using an arrow, and also to put on some kind of scale bar to indicate the size of the pond. So those are both quite important. And other things, I've made a note of a few things you could indicate, things like any islands in the pond, any trees which are overhanging, and you could indicate how much they're overhanging the pond, areas where the slopes are quite steep or inaccessible, and then areas indicate areas of particular vegetation, whether it's emergent vegetation or floating or submerged aquatic vegetation. So that's it really, just general indication of the pond. So it doesn't have to be any kind of great artwork. And then just right at the bottom of this page, just an indication of the percentage of the pond which you are able to get to. So just estimate the percentage. A lot of ponds is going to be 100%, but if areas are inaccessible, then you can just indicate that. So, okay, so then we're on to page 2 of the survey form. So obviously it looks quite complex. A lot of it is quite self-explanatory once you actually read it. So the first thing to look at is the area of the pond. So the key thing here is that it's not the area of the water which might be in the pond at the time when you visit, because if you visit during the summer, that water is often going to be quite low. So the key thing is the area of the winter high water level. So the difficulty of visiting it in the summer is that you often have to estimate that you have to kind of look for clues around the pond to see if you can pick that up. So I'll just give an example of this. So here, for example, this is a photo of a pond taken in November. So the pond is pretty full at this stage, and you can see right the way around the pond, these white arrows indicate this row of a sort of ring of soft rush. So this species tends to grow right at the high water level. So if you can see a ring, a complete ring, like in this pond, it might be a sort of a broken ring. That's a very good indication of where that winter high water level is. So here's another example. This is one of our Ice Age ponds at Cannon Bridge. So this is taken in May. And if you look at where the sheep are in the background, that's actually that's pretty much the high water level. So, and then this is the same pond, but taken a few years earlier, but in July when it was completely dry. And this is much clearer, actually. You can see that ring of rushes right the way around the pond at quite a high level. So the pond's actually much bigger than you might expect if you'd actually visited when, say, on this. Oh, I should check actually. Are you getting much lag? Because
it's fine, honestly, Giles.
Okay, that's all right. Just checking that. So, okay. So if we're on to the estimating the area of the pond, this doesn't have to be an exact calculation. So these are some geometric shapes which can be quite helpful to just estimate estimate the area. So try and work out what shape your pond is roughly, if it's say rectangular or triangular or circular. And you've got the sort of basic formulas for working out the area from the length and the width. So you can measure that either by pacing out if it's quite a small pond, or if it's a larger pond, you might use can be useful to use aerial photos sometimes, like Google Maps, to actually measure the size of the pond. And then for ponds that are more complex, irregular shapes, you can try and break them down into smaller shapes, as it's got the indication here. Maybe it's roughly triangular, or perhaps part of it's square, part of it's circular, something like that. And then on to the next question. This is to do with overhanging trees and shrubs. So the amount to which the pond is shaded, essentially. So you have to imagine is how much of the pond would be shaded if the sun was directly overhead. So, and there's two measures we're looking at. Firstly is how much of the margin is shaded to a distance of at least 1 meter from the shore, as in the top left diagram. And the second measure is how much of the whole pond is shaded. And depending, so this example of a pond here in the photograph, you can see the margin is almost completely shaded. This ring of crack willow trees right the way around the pond. This is actually one of the ponds that's been managed to reduce this amount of willow shading, so it's going to have a very high shade figure for the margin, but the actual percentage of the total pond is relatively low because it's quite a big pond. There's a lot of open water in the center. But this is quite important because the pond margin is the area where you tend to get most of the plants and most of the animal life. So if that's very heavily shaded, it can really reduce the value of the pond for wildlife. One of the reasons for the management. And then we come on to recording, to looking at the aquatic vegetation. And we're really going to be looking at 5 different categories. So these are emergent vegetation. So that tends to be the plants that are rooted in the bottom, and the leaves and foliage are aerial above the water. You've got floating leaved. Again, these are rooted in the bottom with leaves floating on the surface. Got submerged, which are the pondweed type aquatic plants. And then free floating, that's mainly duckweed. And then filamentous algae like blanketweed. So this essentially, what we're going to be recording for these is the percentage of the whole pond. That's again, going by that winter high water level occupied by these various different plants. So for emergent plants, you're also going to be including any dry vegetation like grass, which is growing on the part of the pond which is now dry, even if it would have been submerged during the winter. So these different vegetation types can be quite complex and overlapping. So here's an example of a natural kettle hole pond. And again, you've got quite a rich fringe of emergent vegetation here. And then moving out into the water, you're going to have those other types as well, like the floating and the submerged. Again, another example, this is from Herefordshire, I think. Again, you've got floating leaved broadleaf pondweed in the background, and then the water crowfoot at the front, which is actually a submerged species. That's one of these, actually, I've got a photo of that in a minute. Okay, this photo is really just showing how these categories can mix in together quite well. So here you've got this water mint, which is emergent. You've got broadleaf pondweed, which is floating leaved. And you've also got hornwort and bladderwort underneath, which are submerged plants. So these percentages can add up to more than 100% because you get this sort of layering of plant types altogether. So here is an example of quite a small kettle hole pond. First thing is, again, you can notice this ring of rushes around the high water level. So this photo is obviously taken in winter when the pond was basically full. And the other thing we're looking at is and semi-aquatic grass filling the pond. This is a Glyceria species of also called float grass, and it's actually one of the plants which provides probably some of the best habitat for aquatic invertebrates like water bugs and beetles, things like that. So any kind of grass you see like that will all be counted as emergent vegetation. And then we come on to the submerged species like this hornwort here. So it can be a bit hard to see sometimes because obviously they're under the water. So, but again, you just have to give an estimate if you can see them. You don't need to go wading into the ponds to look for these different species. Another example, the water crowfoot. This one actually, most of the foliage is underwater, but the flowers do stick up above the surface. And then coming on to the floating leaved, so duckweed. So I think most of you will be familiar with this. So we've actually got a couple of different species in this photo on the right, but we don't need to identify the species really. So it's generally, each plant is essentially a single leaf with a single root, although in the greater duckweed at the top right, you can have multiple roots on each plant, but you're probably not going to find that one, although you could do. And then lastly, the blanket weed. So this is often tend to get a lot of blanket weed where ponds are quite polluted with high levels of nutrients. So that's one thing to look out for. And if you, in the worst cases, it can really smother a lot of vegetation. Here's a kind of close-up photo. Again, it's fairly easy to recognize. And then we've also got this question about the percentage of the water area. So this is just the area of water at the time of the visit, not the whole pond area, which is covered by vegetation. So obviously this pond is pretty much 100%, but a lot of ponds it's going to be less than that. So this question is the exception because it does relate only to the water, not to the entire pond area. So now we're coming on to the water left in the pond. So typically in the pond, what you have is you have the winter high water level, and then you have the summer water level, which in the case of some ponds, there'll be no water left at all. And then in between is what you call the drawdown zone, which is the area which is submerged in winter but dry in summer. And that tends to be the part of the pond that is the richest in pond life. So both plants and animals tend to be found, especially in this drawdown zone. So it's very important that you don't ignore that when you visit a pond just because it's dry at the time when you visit. So the drawdown height is the difference between the water level when you visit and what you estimate to be the maximum water level. Here's another clue for working out that winter level. You see this dead oak tree here. It's got a bit of a tide mark around the base, so you can use that to estimate again that winter high water level. It's probably about 20 centimeters more than what it is at the moment. And to just show you how extreme the changes can be, here's this pond in February. So you can see pretty massive pond. And then a few years previously in April, there's almost no water left at all. This is the same pond. It's really, really shrunk in extent. Although it's not. And then we come on to grazing. So essentially, first you've got a yes/no question whether or not the pond is grazed at all. So that's not just whether there's livestock in the field currently, but I mean, generally you can tell if it's a pasture field which would have livestock in. And then there's again a couple of measures: the percentage of the whole pond which is grazed, so, and then the percentage of the perimeter which is grazed. And you have to make allowance that these animals can wade into the water to feed, because they'll feed on the water plants, or just sort of wade into the pond to feed on plants they can't reach otherwise. And then it asks you for a grazing intensity score on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 would be grazed very infrequently, and 5 would be extremely heavily poached, a lot of bare ground. So in this example here, it's probably something like a 3. It's kind of intermediate. So for grazing, we're really just talking about grazing by domestic livestock, whether it's horses or cattle or sheep. So we're not talking about grazing by wild animals like deer or rabbits, and you're not talking about grazing by waterfowl like ducks or geese. And surrounding land use. So we've got 2 distance categories. So 0 to 5 meters from the pond edge, and then 0 to 100 meters from the pond edge. And for each one, we want a column which should add up to 100%, showing how much of the area of that distance from the pond falls into these different categories. So one of the, and there's a bit more explanation on these in the pond manual, and so with the grassland types, you don't need to worry too much about the different grassland. Often it's a bit hard to tell, but a lot of it would tend to be semi-improved grassland. The sort of true, very unimproved grassland is quite rare. So then so here's an example. So you've got the pond there, you've got your 5 meters away from the margin, and then 100 meters away. So for the 5 meter zone, you can normally do that quite easily while you're standing at the pond. But for the 100 meter distance, it can be quite helpful to use some aerial photographs like Google Maps. So for an example, here's a pond, Kington, and you can see this is typical improved pasture in the foreground and in the background as well. So you see it's bright green. It's obviously received quite a bit of fertilizer. There's a lot of grass, but there's not many other plants like flowers and things. It's really just grass, and it's not very exciting type of vegetation. So here again is the same pond on the Google Maps view, and I've overlaid the 100 meter diameter. So again, doesn't have to be an exact, but essentially what percentage of the different land use types are within that distance. So as you can see, most of it is going to be that improved pasture. But then on the east side, we've also got an area of arable land. And then we've got the road as well. We've got the area of farm buildings at the bottom, and then some trees and hedgerows. And I think that for that pond, that's pretty much what there is. So you just have to estimate what that's going to be. Okay, so that's the second page dealt with. So now on the third page of the form, first going to look at invasive species, which Will touched upon earlier. And so these are particular ones we're interested in recording. And as Will highlighted, this New Zealand pygmy or Crassula helmsii is the main species we're concerned about because it's quite common and it's increasing and it's very easily spread between ponds. So I suppose the number one priority is that you don't contribute to spreading it anymore. So if you find it at a site or you visit a site where it's known to occur, you need to be especially careful with cleaning your nets and boots and things like that to just make sure you don't spread, because it will grow from even a very tiny fragment, maybe just a few millimeters size piece. And again, I think similar to the photo we'll put up, it's got a succulent plant. It might have these white flowers, it might not. And this is what it tends to look like. It's going, so you see it's really carpeting all the ground here. It's growing in amongst these bulrushes, but there's really no room left for any of the native plant species to live in this area. It's just swamped everything out. And on a really, when it really gets going, you can get something like this. This is the pond in Wales. And basically everything you can see is Crassula. It's just covered the entire area of the pond, apart from the open water in the center. Again, from a different direction. So it's sort of forms a kind of a mounded growth form and tends to grow in that drawdown area between the high water and the low water levels. So it will also grow submerged as well. So And that's Crustula. And then onto the other species, which you're much less likely to find, although this species actually has recently been found in an Ice Age pond in the west of the county. So this is floating pennywort. It's actually related to our native marsh pennywort, but the difference is our native species has the leaf stalk attached right in the center, kind of like an umbrella, whereas this one you see the leaf has a slit down the side, so the stalk is actually joined to the kind of the margin of the leaf, and you've got quite a crinkly outline to this kidney-shaped leaf, and it's a very, very rapidly growing plant. And you can see this is meant to be water, obviously, but it's just formed a massive kind of floating mat over the surface. So if it's present at a pond, you're probably going to notice it because it does get quite extensive. And another invasive species, parrot's feather. This is one that's very commonly grown in garden ponds. So, and it's actually a submerged aquatic plant, but it also forms these emergent stems out of the water. It's quite a sort of feathery leaf. So again, when it gets going, can occupy quite large areas, just swamping out any native vegetation. And then on the non-native pondweeds, like Canadian pondweed, it's a very well-known one. It's actually introduced in the 19th century, so it's now very well established. It's possibly even declining somewhat. So main feature is that the leaves tend to be arranged in whorls of 3, and the leaves are relatively broad, often a bit broader than in this photo here. And so this is an exclusively submerged kind of oxygenating plant. And it's now been joined by this related species, Elodea natalii, which is much more recently introduced. It's very similar, also got leaves in whorls of 3, but the leaves tend to be much narrower and they're kind of twisted and curved back, like you can see quite well in this photo. So it does look quite distinctive when you see them. And thirdly, curly waterweed. This is, again, very commonly grown in garden ponds. It's often actually, people call it Canadian pondweed, but it's actually this species, which is slightly different. It tends to be rather denser growing, and the leaves aren't arranged in whorls. They're arranged kind of spirally or often quite densely, so you can't really see how they're arranged. But so this is a pond occupied by the curly waterweed. You see how it's breaking the surface, which the other species don't tend to do anything like as much. So it's quite distinctive, and this is, again, it's a very persistent species. Because it roots in the bottom, it's quite hard to eradicate because it just grows back from the roots even if you clear it out. And then we've got water fern. So this is a free floating plant. It's quite like duckweed. The difference is, instead of just each plant being a single leaf, it's actually got a whole cluster of little tiny scale leaves. And I don't have a close-up of that, but it's quite see it, and it's often associated with kind of high nutrient polluted ponds, and it does tend to come and go somewhat. So that's, so far, hasn't been a big problem in Herefordshire. And lastly, we've got things like non-native ornamental water lilies, which you probably recognise, often pink flowers, and leaves are often rather more mounded up compared to the native water lily. So, and then on to habitat quality for amphibians. So this isn't relating to the pond itself. This is relating to the terrestrial habitat around the pond in proximity. So again, you've got some quite good detailed descriptions here on the form. And again, you really just need to try and estimate it from a scale of 1 to 4. And just a few examples. Here's one of the Wildlife Trust nature reserves. So it is not a natural pond, but you can see in the background, you've got this kind of scrubby vegetation. You've got a mix of long grass and trees. You might have woodland, kind of good semi-natural vegetation with a good kind of habitat structure. So a lot of hiding places and foraging areas for amphibians to live and feed in. And another site, again, quite a nice pond, site, and it's rather more grazed grassland, so much, well, not so many opportunities for amphibians, but still quite reasonable habitat. Got a few things like this dead tree in the background. So that would probably be a sort of 3 score. And then at the other extreme, obviously, pond really in very poor habitat at all. You know, just say arable field really. So, and then if we move on to water quality. So this is where it's quite helpful to be able to do a bit of a pond dip and just to estimate how many invertebrates and different species of invertebrates are living in the pond. Just give you an idea of how good it is. So again, so in very polluted ponds, obviously you don't tend to get very much. You might get just very limited biodiversity, things like tuberflex worms and rat-tailed maggots, which I haven't got a picture of actually. So I was just going to go through a few of the different invertebrate species you might come across, indicating of good water quality. So for instance, dragonflies and damselflies, like this four-spotted chaser here, need relatively clean water for breeding in. So this is the larva of one of the dragonfly species, and so quite a lot of species you're likely to get in Herefordshire. And then damselflies again, should be, if you visit in the summer, should be quite obvious if you've got large numbers of these. These are egg laying. And then the larvae, similar to the dragonfly larvae, but rather more slender with these 3 tails at the back, which are actually gills. And then other species. So caddisfly larvae, they form these distinctive cases made out of bits of plant or bits of rock, things like that. Sometimes snails that get included as well. So these are breathing, these species are all breathing through gills, so they do need quite well oxygenated water. So they tend to be some of the more sensitive species. Whereas a lot of the adult pond insects, like this water boatman and this diving beetle, they'll actually breathe surface air just by coming up to the surface. So they're rather less dependent on oxygen actually in the water because they're breathing from the surface. So diving beetle larvae you might see, rather ferocious predators. And then lastly, snails, and there's also a mayfly nymph on top here. So snails, a lot of the pond snails are also air breathing, and they tend to be fairly tolerant of low oxygen conditions. So it's just really, if you are able to do a bit of a pond dip, just really, it's just to provide an estimate of how many species you think there are in the pond. You don't have to identify anything in particular. So, and then moving on to turbidity. Oh no, so water hog louse, this is, these are related to woodlice. They're actually scavengers. They tend to feed on dead and decaying leaves, which fall into the pond, any kind of decaying vegetation. So again, these are quite resistant to low oxygen conditions. So if you get a lot of these and not much else, it's probably not the best sign. And yeah, so turbidity now. So we want to do is find an area where the water is approximately 20 centimeters deep and look in and see how well you can see the bottom. So this pond on the left, you can see it's very clear. You can easily see this mud at the bottom compared to the pond on the right, which is extremely turbid and you can't really see in very far at all. So just giving this a score from 1 to 4, depending on how clear the water is. And then pollution. So this section isn't really asking you to assess how polluted the pond itself is. It's asking for any particular signs of sources of pollution that will be affecting the pond. So for instance, like this large manure heap here could be running off into a nearby pond, or likewise farmyards. If they're draining into a pond, that's going to cause issues with pollution, or other things like intensive pasture which will be receiving fertilizer, or arable land, the same, fertilizer and pesticides. So if that's within the pond catchment, that could all be running off into the water and causing a problem. And likewise, if you've, I'm going to come on to waterfowl in a minute, but if you've got things like grain put down for ducks, that's also going to be causing a pollution issue. So, or anything else that seems like it could be affecting the pond, you can go in this section. And then inflows and outflows. So with the natural kettle hole ponds, you don't normally expect that there's going to be any inflow or outflow, because essentially it's a closed depression. There shouldn't really be any streams in or out of the pond. But what you can have sometimes, you'll have you might have drainage which has been dug, or maybe pipes entering or leaving the pond, and so, and obviously some ponds are actually dammed as well. So anything like that, and any kind of modifications to the pond in particular need to be recorded. And also if there are any islands present, because the natural kettle hole ponds don't tend to have islands in the middle. So that's often a sign that the pond has been dug out or it's been modified in some way. Potentially you can have natural ponds which have been then subsequently dug out. So you could have an island perhaps where they've dug out part of the pond to make it deeper, and then they've piled up the spoil to make a bit of an island. So it's not completely ruling it out as being an ice age pond, but it's not generally a good sign. And so, and then you've got a space for any other information you might want to add. So you could include things like here, like any records of species that you've managed to identify, or anything else particularly relevant. And then on to this. So this is the last page I'll be dealing with. So if we carry on to how often does the pond dry out? So this is quite difficult to answer just by looking at the pond. So ideally, if you can speak to someone who knows, like the landowner or someone local, they should be able to give you a good idea. And otherwise, you can try and estimate it from looking at the characteristics of the pond. Obviously, if it's completely dry at the time of visit, you know it's going to dry out quite frequently. And ponds that dry out tend to have quite a hard, solid base, rather than a lot of damp mud, because as Will was covering in his talk, you get oxidation of the sediment. So sediment that tends to accumulate when the pond is wet will oxidize away and decay while the pond is dry. So again, there's a bit of a grey area sometimes, but try and estimate how often the pond is likely to dry up. And then waterfowl. So these can be a particular issue with two species we're looking at in particular. So mallards, especially the domestic mallards that are released for shooting, and also Canada geese. So if you visit a pond and there's just the one or two things, like maybe one or two ducks or a moorhen or something like that, that's not going to be an issue. That's what you'd expect naturally. But if you visit and there's whole flocks of ducks which are obviously being reared for shooting, that is going to cause severe problems to the pond and really be quite damaging. So here's an example. This is Mockers Park. These are very important natural ice age ponds, and this pond here has been fenced off for mallard rearing. This is obviously a fox-proof fence, and you can see quite a lot of mallards using the pond, and you can see the effect on the water quality is basically pretty awful, and not much vegetation left because the ducks have destroyed most of it, apart from the rushes, which are quite tough. So you can see this pond's really been severely damaged by the ducks, and there's also going to be a long-term issue in that all the waste from the ducks and the food that's put down for them is going to raise the nutrient levels for the long term. So even if you take the ducks away, there's still going to be this ongoing sort of legacy of damage to the pond. And then Canada geese. So these were introduced quite a while ago, I think, but they in the 20th century they've really been increasing rapidly. So the numbers have shot up considerably. So this is Brockhall Quarry. It's obviously not a natural pond, but these flocks of geese will fly around between different ponds. So they may or may not be present at the time of your visit, but especially on the larger ponds, you can get quite an impact. So this is one of the ponds at Kenchester. You can see very heavy mine. So, and as I said earlier, this is the key part of the pond for a lot of wildlife. So when that's affected, it's really going to have quite a severe effect on the species living in the pond. You can see all the footprints of the geese there. And so then if we move on to fish. So that's one of the key factors in the wildlife a pond will support is whether or not there are fish present. And some species will be affected more than others. So here we've got a great crested newt larva. And this is probably one of the species that's most affected by fish because the larvae tend to swim around in the open water, so they're very vulnerable to predation. So what they really need is a large but fish-free pond. And whereas on the other hand, toads can actually coexist quite well with fish because toads are quite toxic and their spawn and their tadpoles are also quite toxic and distasteful, so the fish tend to leave them alone. So even ponds with fish can support some quite valuable species, including large toad populations. So that's one thing to look out for. And this here's a common carp. So this is probably the most damaging kind of fish which you tend to get. These are not native to Britain, but they're often stocked for fishing and increasingly so. You know, it's a very popular fishing fish, and they tend to root around in the mud and they destroy the plants, and they will eat a lot of the different animal species as well, and they tend to really stir up the water and cause considerable turbidity. And I think I've got a photo of that coming up. So other species of fish do tend to have less of an impact. Again, any fish are really going to be bad news for great crested newts, but they're not going to have such a bad impact compared to carp, especially on the plants and things. So, and so signs of fish you might look out for. Obviously, if you've got fishing platforms installed, that's a pretty clear sign. If you've got ripples from where the fish are topping at the surface, that's a good sign of fish. And if you've got very turbid water like this, again, that tends to be a sign of carp, although you can have other causes of turbidity, like, for instance, a lot of runoff from bare soil could cause that, especially in the winter. But local knowledge as well. Obviously, you want to talk to landowners or local people if you can. So here's a photo Will took of two adjacent ponds, and you can see the pond on the left has carp, and the water is very brown and turbid, and the pond on the right does not, and the water is clear. And there are great crested newts breeding in the pond on the right, but not on the left. And you can see this difference even in aerial photos on, for instance, Google Maps. So that's something to look out for. And okay, and pond use. So it's fairly straightforward sort of tick boxes about any particular use of the pond is used for, and you can write details under there. Again, it can be helpful to talk to landowners. They might give you more information. And then information on pond condition and management. So this is particularly looking at management that's taken place recently, so within the past year, but anything else historical management is also very worth recording. Like, for instance, if a pond has been dredged in the past, that's something we really do want to know about. So it might have been even decades ago, but it's still worth recording on the form. Or if part of the pond has clearly been filled in, or it's been dug out in any way, or there's been management to surrounding trees, whether it's trees being planted or trees being removed or cut back. And Then finally, we've got a comments box for anything else that wasn't covered earlier. And that's pretty much it, I think. So now I can hand you over to Beth to complete the geology section of the form. So
excellent. I'm just getting Giles to give me control again. Oh, that was not the intention. I'd say we're just going to skip back through. It exited by accident. There we are. So this is the page that has changed slightly. We've changed the way we're doing augering. So for anyone who's not done it before, it's a lot easier than it was. So when we go and visit the sites, it's useful to do ground sampling. Now, when we go out at this time of year, especially in spring, the ponds will hopefully have quite a bit of water in, and ground sampling is most useful when you can get quite a long way into the pond and it's dry, which is not now. So what we intend to do is ground sampling actually later in the year. There'll be some dedicated augering sessions. But we have changed the way we do it. This is because we're really keen to spot peat. As Will mentioned earlier, peat's a really good indicator, both that there has been a pond on this site for a long time, and also we're able to get information from it. Maybe we'll find plant, mammoth, I hope. We might get pollen records, and peat's a really important resource. So we're looking for peat. The way we are going to do it is when you go out, as I say, there will be more training directly on this, but you've got your auger. That's the thing. You can see the chap Andrew in with the green jacket on. He's holding, and what you do is you stand as near center of pond as you safely can. Safely being an important word. Will's mentioned how muddy and how deep that mud can be. So don't necessarily just head straight out, even if it looks dry. And then what you do is you put your auger together. It normally comes in 3 pieces, as you can see in the picture at the bottom. You, with this new auger, if you imagine anyone's seen it when they're sampling the big fancy cheeses, like a big Stilton, and they have something that looks like a corer rather than, and you push it in and twist. Well, we're using an auger like that these days. So what you do is you stand as near to the center as you can, and you hold your auger keeping your head well back and so that you're not screwing it into the ground. And it's a little bit harder work, but if there's peat, the peat will probably be holding water, and your auger should go in quite easily. So what we're actually asking you to do is to go somewhere and see how easily you can put it into the ground. Now, there are obvious things that might stop this: a rock, tree roots, where a sluice has been. There's no point doing this looking for peat in an undisturbed pond if you're right next to where they just dug it out, because they'll probably have moved it. So when you go in, find a sensible place to do it, and then hold it, pull it down,
I think it looks like Beth's frozen there, isn't it? In mid coring position. I suspect she'll probably try and come back in on a
see how far you can get it in.
Oh.
Keep
Beth, your connection seems to be a bit dodgy. Sorry about this.
Dave?
Yeah?
Why am I on a screen with you?
Because I think you were getting very slow, and you seem to be okay now.
Okay.
Start again, but we lost you for a
Difficulty
bit.
in notes. I will go back. My internet keeps throwing me out, so I do apologise. I have no idea why it's objecting today. So what we're looking for is how hard you find it to get into the ground. So as you go in, just pull down and see how far you can go in. Dave will tell you that when you do it, he watched me do it. It's really hard work if there's no peat. and you are just pulling down. So you might find when you get there, you just can't do it. Take a step sideways, just a step, and try again. You might have hit a rock. If the auger goes into the ground a bit, can't get it in, and you've had a couple of goes and you've moved around to make sure you're avoiding trees, rocks, etc. It's difficult. Step away. You don't have to do anything else. If you can get it in the ground a bit, maybe less than 20 centimeters, mark medium. You've gone in. If you can keep going and that auger just sinks in brilliantly, and I'm not saying you're not working, but you're doing it and it's not too hard, mark easy. When you've got your auger in, twist it about 360 degrees. Imagine you're doing a full circle with your auger, and then gently, keeping your head back, pull it all the way back out and have a look at what is inside your auger. So can you see peat? That's the really exciting bit. If you can, it will be black or very dark brown. You might be able to see little fragments of black. You might see some sandy pockets or some pebbly pockets. You might find that as you go through, it's very, very wet, as you can see from the picture at the bottom. So I'm going to try and press remote control again. So I can move it on. And it might be that if you do go through the water table, which you do sometimes, you will hear it and it'll make a real kind of noise as you go to take it out. Must stress, when you remove that auger, keep your head back out the way of your arms. Really hurts if you hit yourself with the auger. But just to remind you, there will be special auger training, as it were. Part of the reason for that is that it can be hard work and it's nice to be able to share equipment, which at the moment we are not doing. So, moving on, hopefully, wake up. Yeah, so pond base. This is a very random question, and you will be given lots of maps when you go out to site. You'll get to see this tomorrow if you're out. If you came out with us before, you may have seen them. And one of the ones you'll be given is a geological map. For this, that's the map you need. And it's part of something called the SIM surveys, which allows us to compare the quality of the ponds in Herefordshire with ponds right the way across the country. For that, they need this very odd piece of information, which is to do with what the rock type under the pond is. Now, theoretically, you might be able to see it, but in reality, you won't. All the rock will be, and the pond surface will be covered with grass, field, maybe mud. So use the geological maps you've been provided with. There are several boxes. Every single one needs a number. When you look, the vast majority of ponds we ask you to look at will be on either hummocky moraine, that's marked on a geological map with a pale green, or occasionally lake deposits or till, both marked with a blue. And you get a key, in which case they're on essentially clay, maybe cobbly, but mostly clay. In which case, what you have to do in your boxes, if up to a third of your pond is something, so that's including stuff it isn't. If you are on hard rock, you give it a 3. The vast majority of your ponds will be on clay, so you'd give silt and clay a 3, and then every other box a 1. Possibly, fingers crossed, you'll have a pond that's fantastically peat filled. It's marked as a brown on the map. You've done your augering, you've found peat, that's great. You might want to put a 3 for your peat. But in reality, this is all about looking at the map, not what you can see on the ground. But this does allow us to compare with other ponds and look at the potential. So although random, that's what the point of this question is. So then water level recording. We're trying to find out where the water comes from and goes to. As Giles mentioned, as water levels go up and down, they create a zone that's very important for wildlife. And what we're trying to find out is how much that changes over the course of a year. So when you visit, we are asking you to mark down where the edge of the pond is. And we're doing this using GPS. We are starting to get repeat visits on certain ponds, or where ponds have someone who's very close and very keen, starting to get someone who's taking those measurements for us so that we can look at how high, how low, how fast that happens, that kind of thing. So to do it, this is the same pond Giles showed earlier, and you can see its size really does vary from absolutely huge to fairly small puddle, in fact. And when you're there in between, we would like to know, we've got the date of your visit, so where actually was the pond edge? So go up to the edge of your pond, and using the GPS app that you'd used originally, go round the pond. Stand with your feet as near to the pond edge as you safely can. Again, there's no point standing 10 meters back because that's not the edge of the pond. And there's no point trying to fight your way through bushes, thigh-high nettles, that kind of thing. And if possible, aim to record the extremities, so the widest bits or the narrowest bits. The more readings we have, the better. So as you go around the pond, if you have a tiny pond, no, big puddle, 3 readings. As the ponds get bigger, 5, 7, 9. I'm going for odd numbers. This is because what we do is we use these readings to put them on our geographical information systems. That's our fancy online maps. And it locates them by contour. And if you've got readings, because there'll always be a little bit of accuracy issues, it's not to do with you, it's just to do with satellites and technology. We try and go for an odd number of readings because that way you're unlikely to have an exact number on one contour and an exact on the other. For those familiar with normal Ordnance Survey maps, your contours tend to be quite far apart. On the maps we give you for the ponds, we have contours at 10 centimetre intervals, so they're a lot more accurate. So yeah, we ask you to do an odd number if possible. And finally, if you're using the various apps, we ask you to put what it says is the accuracy of the reading. Although we're learning as we do this that that's less helpful than we'd at first thought. And finally, looking at some water chemistry, some people may be given a fancy gadget like the one you can see in the top picture, and this will monitor air temperature, water temperature, electrical conductivity, and pH. So the electrical conductivity is a way of measuring pollution or stuff that's dissolved within the water. It's actually looking for that, and it fires a tiny little bit of electricity between 2 tiny little needles on it. And it's a good proxy for pollution. And the pH we're using because it's a good way of comparing quality. And also, as Will mentioned before, ponds that are very acid will look slightly different. Now, if you're out, some people will be given the fancy meters. And if you get one, you'll be given a very clear set of instructions on how to use it. For everyone else, you'll be given these pH strips. This is new. We didn't have them when we did this last time. The picture at the bottom shows you them. They're tiny. They're about less than 7 centimeters long. And you can see they've got 4 colored squares on the end. Take your strip, put it in the water for half a second. So it really is in, out. And then the box or container that they come in has lots of little charts. They measure in half intervals, so pH of 0, 0.5, 1, etc. And you hold it up and you do a colour matching exercise. And it doesn't take long. When you're doing it, it's going to give you a number. Write that down on your chart. Just a little note, the colour can run when they're wet. So don't put them in your coat pocket. You'll be given sample bags, shove them in a sample bag and then dispose them with household rubbish if you're not out with us. And when taking water samples, Will mentioned it before, water can be deep. The main risk is getting wet. It's not very nice. So bend down and we've got little tiny sample jars. This isn't because we want you to send us the samples unless we specifically ask you to. It's just so that you can bend down, take a little sample at a point that's safe and then do the water testing while stood up and slightly further away from the edge of the pond. We'll be demonstrating this when we do the practical training. To go with our pH strips, we also have phosphate and nitrate measuring. Again, for phosphates, a little green fancy meter. If you are given one of these, there'll be a full set of instructions to help you use them. We're interested in phosphate because it can help determine pollution in the pond and help us work out how we're going to, or potentially advise people to manage it in the future. The same is true of nitrates. If you don't get that, you will be given some nitrate testing strips. To use this one, again, very similar. I know it's not very clear on this. I don't have any heavily polluted ponds to hand, which means I don't have ones which are obviously the colours changed. So when you get them, there are 2 little pads on a little strip. Dip it into the water without motion. It's very clear about this. So just hold it in the water for 2 seconds, take it out, wait a minute, and then compare the colour that those pads have gone. They go a slight pinkish shade, and we're only interested in the pad furthest from the handle, the end pad. And you just compare and then write down the number that you get. These ones, the pads are a little soft, squishy. Again, they need to be disposed of with household waste, and just put them in your little sample bag to throw away at the end of the day. And then if you've taken samples because we've asked you to, certain ponds we might be interested in, we're hoping to do some work with Birmingham University later in the year to do a big study. So we might be sending people out and saying, please take pond samples, in which case you'll be given labels, jars, bags to keep everything dry, to send us back. But then having done all your surveying, we'd get you to return your sample and any equipment you've borrowed back to Queenswood at a pre-arranged time. So I think that's all the questions that are marked on the survey sheet. So I will get Dave to take charge, but
we're getting to the end of our allotted time. So just to mention, as I said before, I will be sending out a link, an invitation to the get-togethers we're going to be having over the next few Fridays. It could be, if I can persuade Giles to do a sort of more elaborate session on pond plants, I think there's a basis of it in his talk there, but it may be a bit more detail on pond plants, and we can maybe have also if that's a relatively short session, we can have a question and answer session following the practical pond sessions we're having this weekend. So, and then as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a session on aquatic invertebrates and amphibians, and then the site selection, and then there's one on the geological side of things. So for the next few Fridays we'll have get-togethers as well. So in place of actually meeting up and seeing each other, we can do this again. So unless there's any other immediate questions, I will thank you all very much for coming, and hope to see at least some of you tomorrow. And thank you very much.